It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Charles Kemp, who is coming to us from Melbourne. I suppose you're in Melbourne, Charles. Yeah. So Charles is professor at the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He got his BA from the Uni of Melbourne in 2000 and a BA honours, Bachelor of Science rather, honours in 2001. And then went off to MIT, where he did a PhD supervised by Josh Tannenbaum in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences. So quite a rarefied pedigree there. His 2008 PhD, you can get it online. It's on the acquisition of inductive constraints using a Bayesian statistical approach to learning. And his work looks broadly at computational models of learning and reasoning and categorization. And so a lot of that, of course, relates to language. And that's to some extent what we're going to be hearing about today. Charles is a member of the governing board of the Cognitive Science Society, and he is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, sort of just coming up on his second year of his fellowship. So that's exciting, and I think it's probably still early days for us to start learning about what's going on with that. So perhaps next time Charles will be giving us the rundown on that work. If you look at Charles's publication record, it's quite stunning if you have a sense of the journals that he chooses to publish in. So Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Cognition, Psych Review is, I keep doing a double take because in my old job with lots of psychologists, a paper in Psych Review was a sort of a once in a lifetime defining thing, and Charles has about 5 or 6 papers, so it's like his newsletter or something. He's published in Science. And a recent paper that he's done, co-authored with Yang Xu and Terry Regier, was published in the Annual Review of Linguistics, which is one of the annual review journals, but the linguistics one is relatively recent. And it's a really stimulating and really interesting contribution. And I gather that we're going to be hearing about work along those lines today. So Charles's talk today is titled "Word Meanings Across Languages Support Efficient Communication." So I think this is the question of communication, of language function, of semantic typology. All of these things are of interest to us. So I'm excited to hear your talk, Charles, and I'm pleased to have you here. So can I now hand over to you? You can share your screen, do as you need to, and I'll let you take the floor. Charles.
Thank you, Nick, for the very kind introduction, also for the invitation to be here and to have the chance to talk about some of my work. So let me share my screen and jump in. I'm going to be talking about this work, looking at the theme of efficient communication in the lexicon and a little bit to do with grammar as well. First, I'd like to acknowledge the people involved in this work, the collaborators, in particular, Noga Zaslavsky, who led the work on color that I'll be talking about, and Frank Mollica, who led the work on tense, and also the ARC and NSF, who've provided funding for this line of work. So the big question that I'm going to talk about today is how people organize experience into named categories. And my background coming into this was as a psychologist interested in categorization, but I think linguistics is a place where the most interesting applications happen if you look at the categories picked out in different languages around the world. So as an example, we'll be talking about throughout color naming. If you look at the grid here of color chips, different languages around the world have different ways of carving up this grid into named categories. So I'm showing you maps here for 2 languages, Wobe from the Ivory Coast. This is a color system with just 3 color categories. And so to read these maps, all of the regions in the grid up here, colored with the same color, are covered by the same term in the color system. So you can see the 3 Wobe terms over here on the right. Buglaire down here from Panama is a color system, has a color system with more categories, and you can see those categories here on the right. So these data here, these are taken from the World Color Survey, and I'll be using those in some of the analyses that follow. One of the really interesting things when you look across category systems across languages is that there are intriguing patterns which seem to have some universals and a lot of variation too. So we've already seen some of the variation across languages. Let me show you an example of some of the apparent universals. So we've got variation on the right of the slide here. On the left, you often have languages from different families that have strikingly similar color systems. So here we have languages from different parts of the world, and it seems that languages like Barinmo here and the other 2 from different parts of the world, different language families, but they seem to have converged on very similar category systems. And so this pattern of this mixture of apparent universals and a lot of variation is something that's provoking and interesting and intriguing to try to explain. As a second example we'll be talking about today, let's think about how the timeline gets carved up into name categories. And so here we're going to be looking at grammatical tense markers. For purposes today, we're going to use a simple discretized timeline that has just 7 levels here along the timeline. So we've got present, 3 pasts varying in remoteness. So immediate past, an intermediate past, a remote past, and 3 levels of future as well. In English tense system, we distinguish between past, present, and future, shown by the colors down here. But other languages around the world sometimes have more categories than that. So I'm showing you here, Zulu has distinctions between different levels of past and different levels of future, and this is common, I believe, among Bantu languages. So the kind of data that you see in the monographs from which our data are taken look a bit like the table here on the right, documenting the tense system here for Zulu. Okay, so as Nick already mentioned, I think semantic typology is the name that this kind of work goes by in linguistics. And this chapter by Nick Evans has a really great quote at the start from David Lewis, which is kind of setting up the research question. So we want to understand the way in which nature gets carved at its joints, and I suppose the fact that there can be different ways to carve nature at its joints. Okay, the approach that I'm going to talk about really connects with a line of work that's been going on for a long time in linguistics, and this theme of competing motivations, which is the idea that linguistic systems are shaped by 2 competing forces. So in one formulation, going back more than a century, Gabor-Lenz refers to the drive for clarity and the drive for comfort and talks about trade-off between those things. If you think about optimality theory, there's this competition between principles called faithfulness and unmarkedness. If you think about the literature on pragmatics, so people like Horn talk about principles like the Q principle and the R principle. And again, there are these 2 basic ideas that are in conflict, and the idea is that linguistic systems achieve trade-offs between these things. There's a paper on communicative efficiency, which has this table here that I really like, and it talks about all of the theories here. And I think it's fair to say that in all of these theories, in some form or other, there's this idea of a trade-off between the 2 basic principles that we're seeing on the left here, something like the drive for clarity. We want to use language to say as much as we can, and the drive for comfort. We're a little bit lazy. We want to cut corners. We don't want our utterances to be too long and too elaborate. And so this idea of 2 competing principles runs through a very large part of the literature here, and we're going to kind of try to build on that today. So given this, I suppose, long history, you might ask what's new. So what's new, I think, is that I'm going to suggest that it's possible to think about these competing motivations in terms of ideas from the literature on information theory, and to come up with formal computational definitions of these principles. And that gives us a new way, I think, to look at some of the data coming from the field of semantic typology. So in one slide, here's kind of the general proposal that I'm going to be talking about throughout. The idea is we're going to be talking about ways to formalize two competing principles. So I'm going to call them communication cost and complexity, and I'll say more about what they are in a minute. And the idea is, so let's use color for an example. Every possible color system, every possible way of taking those color chips and organizing them into categories is going to lie somewhere, is going to be a point that lies somewhere in the white region of this diagram here. And the gray region, that's going to be a region that's just inaccessible. No possible color system could lie here. And the idea is there's going to be some optimal way to trade off these two principles. And that optimal frontier is the red line here. So roughly speaking, the guiding idea is that linguistic systems are near optimal. They're going to tend to lie close to this optimal frontier. So I've annotated 3 points along the frontier. If we start with this system here, imagine a color system where you have just a single term and you use that term for all of the different color chips in the array. Well, that's going to be low in complexity, just one term to remember. But using that system, you're going to incur a very high communication cost, because if you're using that term, the recipient is going to have little idea of the particular hue that you were trying to convey. At the other extreme, imagine that you had, I think there are about 300 color chips in the array. Imagine that you had a different word for every single one of those color chips. So complexity would be very high, but communication cost would be low, because you'd be able to convey precisely the particular hue that you were thinking about. And in the middle here, in the intermediate range, this is an example of a theoretically optimal system that's intermediate in complexity and communication cost. So this is the kind of system that looks a bit more like what natural languages have. So what I'm going to focus on today is to show you how we can apply this framework to the examples of color naming and tense marking. And then if I have, sorry, I hit the wrong button. If I have time, I'll say a little bit about how we explore some related ideas looking at categorization in the physical environment and the notorious topic of words for ice and snow. Okay, so to show you how we actually implement this framework in the case of color, imagine a communicative scenario. So we have, I'm going to do this in terms of spoken language here, but same ideas apply to sign as well. Imagine we have a speaker here, and the speaker maybe catches a glimpse of a garment of clothing in dim light and is a little bit uncertain about exactly what the hue might be. And so this distribution here captures the speaker's uncertainty about the true hue of the dress, say. The speaker utters a word, blue, in an attempt to convey the hue to a listener. And upon hearing that word, the listener comes up with this distribution here, which captures the listener's beliefs about what the hue might look like. So this is a probabilistic approach. Note that there's uncertainty in both the speaker's representation and the listener's representation, but the listener's representation is, the distribution here is wider, so more uncertainty on the part of the listener. Okay, so in terms of this very simple scenario, we can formalize the two dimensions that I mentioned to you before. So this notion of communication cost, we formalize that in terms of the expected KL divergence between the speaker's distribution and the listener's distribution. So I won't define KL divergence for you here. I'll just say it's a standard information theoretic measure of something like the dissimilarity between two distributions. So KL divergence is high to the extent that the listener's distribution is very different from the speaker's distribution. For complexity, again, we're going to formalize that in terms of information theory. So the exact information theoretic definition we use is here. This is the mutual information between the word uttered and the speaker's representation. So you can think of this as something like the amount of information in bits that the word conveys about the speaker's representation. For the purposes of today, if you just think about complexity in terms of the number of terms in the system, that's good enough. That's kind of 95%, I think, of the idea behind this measure here. And so this particular way of formalizing these two dimensions, it's not that these definitions are arbitrary. In fact, they come out of a branch of information theory that people in that part of the literature have been exploring and working with for a long time. So I think Claude Shannon was the first to analyze these sorts of trade-offs in information theoretic terms like this. And Noga Zaslavsky, I mentioned her before, she kind of pointed out the connection between that existing line of work and the ideas I'm going to talk about related to semantic typology. Okay, so with these definitions in hand, we can go to a data set and see where natural languages fall in this kind of space. For each system in a natural language, we can compute its complexity and its communication cost and plot it in a diagram like this. So I mentioned before this branch of literature looking at information theory and the fact that these ideas are widely explored outside linguistics. In fact, in the literature that Noga Zaslavsky comes from, people typically invert communication costs and they draw their diagrams this way. So accuracy on the y-axis is just the inverse of communication costs. So I'm going to show you Noga's diagrams which have that y-axis flipped, but it's really the same idea. So now the unachievable regions up here. Prediction is still that languages would lie along this optimal frontier. Okay, so to actually implement the theory and compute the communication costs and complexity for a language, we need a couple of additional pieces. So first of all, we need to be a bit more precise about what these speaker distributions are. In the picture I showed you before, I was working with simple diagram where there's just a one-dimensional color space and a distribution over that. For the actual results I'm going to tell you about, we use a three-dimensional color space. This is the CLAB color space, and this is a psychologically inspired color space such that distances in CLAB space tend to roughly approximate psychological distances. So the fact that this color space is lumpy is important, and the bumps and lumps in this capture something about the psychology and the biology of color vision. So this CLAB space is a pre-existing thing that we're able to build on. And the distributions that we're going to be talking about, you can think of them as something like fuzzy balls in this space. So a speaker seeing a blue dress being a little bit uncertain would have a distribution that's a bit like this fuzzy three-dimensional ball in the blue region of the space. Okay, so those are the speaker distributions. We also need to have a prior distribution capturing the sorts of things that a speaker is likely to talk about. So it might be, for example, that some regions of color space just get talked about more often than others, and that affects the predictions of the theory that we have. There are different ways to formalize this. You actually get fairly similar results if you assume just a uniform prior over color space. The approach that I like the best is one where you base this prior on linguistic data. So you take corpus statistics, number of times, say, English speakers are using red, yellow, and so on, and you use that to kind of reverse engineer a prior over the entire space of color chips that's consistent with that distribution. A very important point is that for the results I'm going to show you, we assume that this prior is universal, so that people in all cultures have the same prior distribution over colors, which effectively means that they communicate with the same relative frequencies about colors. And that's almost certainly wrong. And some more recent work kind of looks at ways in which that assumption is wrong and what you can do if you relax that assumption. Okay, so with these assumptions in hand, we can implement the theory and go ahead and test it on data from the World Color Survey. So this is a data set containing data from about 111 languages. I think these are unwritten languages. And in each case, the researchers involved went out and asked speakers of the different languages to provide labels for all of the color chips in the grid here. And typically, for each of these languages, there's data for about 20 participants per language. And so if you average over all of those responses, you get maps a bit like the ones shown here. So in the pictures I showed you before, sometimes I showed you these mode maps in the middle layer where there's a category assigned to each chip. These at the bottom here, we have pictures that Noga made where there are regions of white showing uncertainty. So if there's a part of the grid up here where it's something like there's no color term that's used, that speakers can agree on, then we're going to show that as white. And this kind of noise and uncertainty in the naming patterns is something that's going to turn out to be interesting. Okay, so now we can ask the question, given the data about these languages in the World Color Survey, how close do those color systems, 111 color systems, come to the optimal frontier? And so here is Noga's result, where she takes those 110, 111 languages and plots them in the two-dimensional space that I mentioned before. And so you can see that all of them are lying fairly close to the optimal frontier. Some of them are not entirely on top of it, but all of them are close. And so I think the suggestion here is that color systems look the way they do because they achieve near optimal trade-offs, because they just have to look like that if they're going to be, you know, as useful as possible for the purposes of communication. And so at the start, I mentioned these two themes of universals and variation that you see when you look at semantic typology. And I think this approach gives us some perspective on that. It says, well, yes, there can be variation, and in fact, large variation, because languages can make different trade-offs between these dimensions. And a language down here that, say, prioritizes simplicity is going to look very different from a language up here that prioritizes accuracy over complexity. So framework definitely allows a lot of scope for variation. But there's also a sense in which universals are important. The framework says, let's suppose that we're going to have a language which makes a certain kind of trade-off between the two dimensions that puts it roughly about here. Then the framework says, well, there's only one optimal way to make that trade-off. And this might explain why languages from unrelated regions of the world end up converging on similar solutions. The idea would be, well, they're making similar trade-offs between the two dimensions. And if you do make a trade-off, say, that favors complexity over accuracy, there's really only one good way to do that if you're going to have a category system, which is, say, has roughly 3 categories or so. Okay, so let me show you a couple of pictures looking at individual languages and how they relate to what's on the optimal frontier. So on the left, we have maps showing some of the real languages in the data set, including English. And on the right, we have the closest optimal systems on the optimal frontier. And so you can see that in each case, the closest optimal system, it's not getting everything right, but it's giving us a decent account of some of the properties of these individual systems. And so the theory here, at least in some cases, can make some help us to understand individual systems as well as understanding the entire set of 100 systems in aggregate. In particular, it can help us explain, say, in the English system, why we have some of the boundaries between colors in the places that we do in this grid. Okay, so you might be wondering, well, what's not optimal? Is everything optimal? Because if so, that wouldn't be very interesting. And so one way to look at this is to compare actual systems to various hypothetical sorts of systems. And so let me show you just one kind of analysis like that. You can do rotation analyses where you take an actual attested system. So here is Kalina, and you can rotate that system. So rotating means shifting all of the categories and their boundaries to the right, say. And then when categories fall off the right, you just wrap around and put them on the left side. So here, we've moved all of the color boundaries 5 steps to the right. You can also move it 5 steps to the left. If attested systems are actually optimal, you would predict that a rotation of 0 ought to give you the most optimal system among all of this family of rotated systems. And that's what we're seeing here. That's true for Kalina. That's true for most of the systems in the World Color Survey. So notice that these rotated systems, they're not crazy systems. They tend to have connected categories. They're very similar in many respects to the actual systems. So the fact that we find that unrotated systems are more optimal than the rotated variants suggests that the theory is able to tell us something useful about why actual systems are the way that they are. Okay, so the theory also makes some connections with ideas about color evolution from the literature. And so you might know about the Berlin and K hierarchy and the idea that color terms get added to language in a predictable order. So this is a sequence from one of their early contributions in this area. And so the idea is, well, if you have a color system with just 2 categories, then you have one category for light things and one for dark things, so call them white and black. If you were to add just a single category, if you're going to make it slightly more complex and have 3 categories rather than 2, then red is the category that gets added next. And then the next two to get added are green and yellow, and they can be added in either order, and so on. So this sequence here tells you something about the color systems that you'd expect to see across languages. So the theory that I just mentioned recapitulates this theory to some extent. So if you look at the color systems that I'm showing here, it actually the theory makes an error early on. It suggests that yellow rather than red should be the first category to be introduced, and that's an interesting mistake. But after that, the sequence here is roughly compatible with what Berlin and Kay was saying. You can see green and yellow coming in, and then blue, and so on. And to give you a sense for how this works, let me show you a video that Noga made. So what I'm going to show you is a video where we traverse the optimal frontier. So keep your eye on the system up here. This is the optimal system for the current spot along the frontier, and we're going to see what that optimal system looks like as you sweep along the frontier. So starting point, we have the simplest possible system, just one category for everything. Okay, so I'll just stop it there if I can. That's the error I mentioned. The theory suggests that yellow should be the first category that emerges. Okay, and as you sweep it off to the extreme right here, you get a system with one word for every color chip. So one of the interesting things about this to us was that, well, first of all, it provided a continuous trajectory by which color systems might change over time. If you look at the Berlin and Kay sequence, it's very discrete. So the idea is, well, you have black and white, and then red gets added, and so on. And it was always hard for me to think about, well, exactly how would that work? How do you go from one discrete system to another? This theory sort of suggests the possibility for how continuous change might allow you to progress from a simpler color system to a more complex one. Second point of interest here for us is that the theory makes some predictions about inconsistent naming. So remember I mentioned these areas in the plots before that are white. These are cases where there's no strong consensus about what the color name for a particular chip could be. And the theory makes some predictions about where those regions should be and at what stages they should arise in the evolutionary sequence. And so, as I mentioned before, the theoretical prediction is definitely wrong. I mean, it says that yellow should come in first, but we still think there are some interesting things that it suggests about the evolution of color terms. Okay, so having talked about color, let me show you how we can apply similar sort of approach to a different aspect of language. So we're going to look at grammar now rather than the lexicon, and talk about tense marking. And despite this difference, the framework is going to be virtually identical. So again, imagine a communicative scenario. This time though, imagine that we're interested in talking about when events occurred. So here's a 7-event timeline, the one that I mentioned before. So the way to read this is that R is the present moment, and then we have 3 levels of past, 3 levels of future. The speaker is thinking about an event, maybe when somebody arrived, and the speaker is fairly certain that this event happened in the distant past. So here's the speaker's distribution with a higher bump here on the distant past. So because the speaker is referring to this past event and using English, the speaker adds this marker to the verb. And then upon hearing that utterance, here's the distribution that the listener creates. So this is based on the idea that most of the time when people talk about past events, they're talking about things in the more recent past rather than the more distant past. So that's why the listener's distribution is pretty flat, but the highest bump here is on the immediate past. Okay, so different communicative scenario, but the same basic idea, and we can use this communicative scenario to formalize the dimensions of communicative cost and complexity in exactly the same way as we did before. Just as we needed CLAB color space to get the color analysis off the ground, we need some assumptions here about the nature of the distributions that speakers have in their heads. And so we don't have kind of detailed psychometric data, psychophysical data in this case. So we made some simple assumptions. We assumed that there are divisions between past, present, and future. So there are major divisions between those three categories, and then minor divisions within each of those things. So this means, if you look at the top one here, when speakers are thinking about something in the distant past, they might be a little uncertain. So we have highest bump here on the distant past, but they're a little bit uncertain. So maybe the event is in intermediate past, maybe it's in the immediate past too. So we have these assumptions about the distributions that speakers have, and we also need a prior that captures the probability that people need to talk about these different places along the timeline. So again, we're going to assume this is universal. The prior we use is based on data from Twitter, so based on a study that takes a whole bunch of tweets and measures whether they're referring to past, present, or future, and how far into the past or present. So the distribution that we're using is shown here. You can see that present is by far the most common category. You can't quite see it from the picture here, but it's also the case that there's more talk about past events than future events. And that regularity is also, there are actually a number of data sets that let you estimate a distribution like this. I'm showing you a table here from early work by Greenberg based on frequency statistics from 2 languages. And you can see in his data set too, present, most common, and more mentions of past than future. Okay, and that'll be useful for a qualitative result coming out of the model later. Okay, so with these assumptions, we can go ahead and implement the theory. And here is the main result. So this time I've kept the y-axis in the way that I originally showed it, communication cost. And so now all of the black dots are the actual systems in our data set. So this is a data set that we compiled by looking at the literature. So many of the systems are from a book by Dahl on tense and aspect systems, but we also collected others too. The dots are of different sizes because different languages, some different languages are coded the same way according to our 7-element timeline. So the big dots are systems that appear in many different places in the data that we have. So there's a big dot here. This is for languages that don't mark tense, that don't have grammatical tense marking. Of course, those languages give speakers the opportunity to refer to past and present and future and so on. The idea is it's just not marked grammatically. And so in our framework, they end up here on the diagram. The English tense system would be down here. So it's one of the languages which has 3 categories, past, present, and future. And you can see some of the other systems along here as well. So similar to the color work, we see that by and large, attested systems are falling close to the optimal frontier. In the data that we have, there's really only one striking exception, and this dot here is for Hiskariana. And so this one's interesting from the perspective of our framework because it has 3 levels of past. It distinguishes between all 3 levels, but it lumps together the present with the future. So according to our framework, that's inefficient because people talk about the present a lot. And so if you are going to make some distinctions, it's more important to distinguish present from future than to distinguish 3 levels of past. So it's kind of an intriguing puzzle to me why Hiskariana looks the way that it does, and I don't have an explanation for that, but arguably the framework here is useful because it's pointing us to this interesting aspect of Hiskariana. Okay, in addition to that overall summary result, there are some qualitative things that we can look at too. So just as for the color work, the framework here allows for tense systems that are soft. So rather than having discrete category boundaries, soft fuzzy category boundaries. But to make this little example here simpler, I'm showing the deterministic systems that are closest to the optimal systems along the frontier on the right here. So the way to read this is if you have a category system with just 2 categories, then the best way to do that is to have 1 category for past and to have a 2nd category that joins present and future. That's this 2-category system here. Then if you're going to have 3 categories, 1 for past, 1 for present, 1 for future is the best. If you're going to introduce 1 more distinction, then the best thing according to our theory is to split off remote past from the other 2 pasts and so on. And so if you look at these optimal systems here, they capture some, but not all of the things that people have previously noticed in the literature. So one thing they capture is the idea mentioned by Comrie and others that the past tends to be divided more finely than the future. And the reason for that in our framework is just that people tend to talk more about the past than the future. So if that's the case, then if you're going to introduce categories, it makes most sense to have them as distinctions in the past part of the timeline. So I've given our theory here a tick for this one. Here's something where it's not compatible with irregularity observed in the literature. Dahl points out, based on his data, that he thinks the immediate past tends to be carved off before the more remote past. That's not what our theory predicts. So you can see this 4-category system, it's peeling off the remote past before the immediate past. So I'll give the theory across here, but also say that Dahl's, this qualitative result here that Dahl points out is maybe a little less well-founded than Comrie's observation here. So I think our theory is getting something wrong, but it's not quite as bad an error as it might seem. Okay, so I've talked about color and tense marking, and we and others have applied similar ideas to look at a number of different other aspects of language. So here is a summary of some of the different applications, and in each case I'm showing you the 2D figure that's analogous to the kinds of figures that I was showing you before. So we think that, I mean, to us, one of the appealing things about the framework is that it's general and you can potentially apply it to lots of different aspects of language. Okay, so coming back to the outline, I've introduced these ideas and applied them to color naming and tense marking. Let me say just a few words now about the second part, words for ice and snow. So this actually builds on ideas from the efficient communication analyses I was just presenting. I mentioned that the priors in our analyses are assumed to be universal, and that of course is not right. And once you start to think about the idea that you would need different priors in different parts of the world, it's interesting to think about the ways in which that variation might be reflected in category systems around the world. And I think probably the most striking examples of this are from the part of the literature that looks at lexical elaboration, or parts of the vocabulary that have large numbers of words for something that's of particular cultural importance in a particular part of the world. So here are 2 examples. Hanunu language spoken in the Philippines has 92 name varieties of rice, and Somali 46 words for camel. And so these sorts of claims, I think, are a little bit embarrassing for linguists. These sorts of claims, I think that there's a feeling that these are a little bit disreputable and they're exaggerated, and the basis on which they're made is not always entirely clear. And probably this is all tied up partly with the notorious example of Eskimo Aleut languages having many words for snow. So I guess my thought about this is, those of you who know Pullum's piece on this, I completely agree that claims about words for snow are often exaggerated and inflated and so on. Nevertheless, I think there's kind of a kernel of common sense in all of this that's true and interesting. And so maybe the underlying idea here needs to be, deserves to be investigated a little bit more than it has been. So to give you one idea of how we've done that, we looked at an example related to words for ice and snow. So we're not looking at total number of forms for ice and snow. We're looking at something different, whether or not a language has a single term that covers both ice and snow. And we looked at the languages that do include a single term for both ice and snow. And most of those languages are fairly close to the equator. They tend to be found in warm parts of the world. And you can see that plot up here. Languages which have the same term, a single term that covers ice and snow, are associated with relatively high mean temperatures. Languages which have 2 different terms for ice and snow distributed over a wide range of temperatures. So this is consistent with the idea of communicative efficiency. If you're in a warm part of the world, you rarely see snow, then it doesn't really make sense for your language to invest in having 2 separate labels for ice and snow. It's fine to lump them into one thing. The intermediate variable that we think mediates the link between temperature and the lexicon is usage frequency. So the idea being, if you're in a warm part of the world, then you are referring to ice and snow relatively rarely, And so you can afford to have you can get away with a simpler category system. And we have some evidence for that looking at usage frequency on Twitter. So mentions of ice and snow in these different languages. And not surprisingly, the common sense result, in hotter parts of the world, there are fewer people on Twitter talking about ice and snow. So this, I think, along with some other things that we've been trying to do more recently, suggests that maybe you can rehabilitate, the original idea behind the words for snow example, and it might be useful to do that and to try to kind of find and analyze the parts of that are actually true and useful. In case you're interested in the number of words for snow in particular, the best work on that I know is from Krupnik and Willerville, and they say, well, even if you are going to be counting independent stems for ice and snow, well, the English snow vocabulary is quite limited to compared to other language families, including Inuit, Eskimo, and so on. So I think even the particular result that Pullen was arguing against deserves more credit than he actually gives it. Okay, so let me move to my conclusion slide. I had a couple of other examples of looking at how people organize the environment into categories, so terms for seasons and constellations. But I will go now to my conclusion and say, okay, in the first part, I was arguing that languages achieve near optimal trade-offs between communicative cost and complexity, and formalizing these ideas in terms of information theory allows us to make predictions and develop these analyses of interesting rich data sets like the World Color Survey. Second part, arguing that computational models, the same kind of computational models, can give us some insight into how people take the environment and organize it into named categories. So I think I've hit my 40 minutes. I'd be very happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Round of applause for Charles.